Just a little background. As you're aware, in 1970, Sihanouk was overthrown by Lon Nol, and the Khmer Republic, was established and began their support and assistance to our war in Vietnam. So that involved training and all kind of support, from air support to logistics support. When I finished in MACV-SOG, I had the option to return back home or go to the new program that I became aware of, which was focused on training the Cambodian infantry units, airborne units, and special units within Vietnam. We were prohibited from advising directly in Cambodia to the units by the Cooper Church Amendment, and so therefore the training support headquarters was established in Nha Trang, and 3 training camps were established in Vietnam. I was at Hai Training Battalion, which was the old B-36 3rd Mobile Strike Force camp in Long Hai, and there was Phuoc Tuy just down the road, and then Dom Bat Tin. So when I was at SOG headquarters for something, I found out about this program, met some people I knew who were in it, and requested assignment to it rather than to return back home. So interviewed at in Nha Trang, and it was decided I would go to Long Hai, and the position I was in was executive officer for an ODA, an A team. And so the A team was a standard special forces 12-man team, and the program was such that each A team was advising 1 Cambodian battalion. So if you think about a battalion, that's approximately 512 soldiers. And so we would break down as advisors to the separate 3 companies and to the staff. The training program was unique because, first of all, the Cambodians would be flown in from Po Chin Tong Airfield in Phnom Penh directly to the airstrip we had right there at Long Hai. It was a PSP airstrip, but it was C-130 capable. And the units would first send their leadership, battalion commander, the battalion staff, the company commanders, senior NCOs. They would come in, say, 2 weeks before the actual unit. So we had a program of instruction to train the leaders, and this was critical because when the unit came in and began their training, we wanted their chain of command, their leaders, to actually be in command and not just fall in and take orders from the team sergeant or myself or the team leader, but to let their leaders get involved in the training that they had just gone through. So we developed a leadership training program, and we also helped them by giving them overviews of all the training that their soldiers would, be going through. The unit would then fly in, and you would have a brand new unit, 512 soldiers, who were then given brand new kit, all U.S. weapons, uniforms, equipment, and brand new. So, for example, you had the standard M16A1, you had 1911 A145, 60 millimeter mortar, 81 millimeter mortars, and everything again was brand new, down to the helmets, the helmet liners. So they were equipped, and then they had to be taught, well, how do you maintain this equipment? How is it used? And then the training program began with individual skills. So you would take the individual soldier and, for example, familiarization with the M16, assembly, disassembly, the same thing soldiers do worldwide in armies, and train them on their weapon systems. The mortarmen would be there. The machine gunners got M1919 A6 30 caliber machine guns. So the A team had to be jack of all trades and extremely knowledgeable on every weapon system. Other systems were the PRC-25 radio. And so throughout the entire battalion, equipment was issued so that they could operate as a battalion, starting with individual skills. And from that point, we went into squad, then platoon operations, eventually company operations, and we would take them out for short duration operations. And then eventually, at the end of this training period, approximately 9 weeks, they were ready for battalion operations. So what we did then was to take them out. We had designated area of operations. We had the intelligence, and they were running operations into the old Australian area by the Longhais, in the case of my camp. And those operations, again, were 10 or 12 days. You develop the situation, engage the enemy. It got the unit experienced and to get their confidence up. Because at the end of the training cycle, they would come back, clean up, we'd have after-action reviews, do everything we could, and then we would move them down to Vung Tau airfield. And there they would load up and they would have a complete basic load of ammunition that would go back with them. So they were ready to be thrown into the battle against the Khmer Rouge. So that's kind of the overview of the program. But what's so unique about this is that a very, very small group of Special Forces soldiers trained a significant number of maneuver battalions and special units of the Cambodian Army. Now, the Easter offensive that took place in Vietnam in 1972 was significant for the North Vietnamese to come in through Hue and all the other areas. And they hammered the South Vietnamese units. So another problem arose. Now the South Vietnamese units were not well equipped. They had to be rebuilt and get back immediately into the battle. So we got a frag order, which was now keep training the Cambodian units. But by the way, we need to get small groups out of each of the camps, mobile training teams, to go and train up, advise, re-equip, and train the ARVN units. So when you look at the number of maneuver battalions trained in Vietnam for the Cambodians and the South Vietnamese by a very small group of soldiers, and if you go into the paper I sent you, you can look at the statistics. It really is a classic case of Special Forces as a force multiplier and impacting on the battle.
Thank you. And how did the Cambodian battalion level organisation, how did it differ from ARVN? Would it be fair to say there was less reliance on air mobilisation and it was more road-based?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's fair. When they returned back to Cambodia, where I ended up a year and a half later, the assets were significantly less than the South Vietnamese had. So units were moving not as great distances. The big difference is, as the Khmer Rouge closed on Phnom Penh that last year, when they had their New Year's offensive, the front wasn't far to the north, to the south, or any direction. And what they had were surrounded enclaves. Cities, for example, like Svay Rang, which was closer to the South Vietnamese border by Nguyen Ba Dinh. In fact, it was the first time I saw Nguyen Ba Dinh from the other side. And you had these enclaves that had to be resupplied. Aerial resupply was critical for the Cambodians to supply at that point. So maneuver was not a significant challenge as South Vietnam had.
When you were training these Cambodian battalions, were you working with them on combining them with artillery or any air support?
They did have forward observer training, but again, we didn't have artillery to support us. So everything was internal for that unit, for their organic weapon systems, and then how to conduct coordinated operations, with other adjacent units. For one operation, we even did an amphibious landing on an island, which was unique in old World War II landing craft. Unique and bizarre, but that was the mission. And they were going from a wonderful training environment, and there were engagement, there were contacts, and there were some losses. But they were going, into the fire. When they got back to Cambodia, they would be challenged. And as you know, the outcome of the war, it didn't end favorably.
What was your assessment, yourself and your comrades, sharing thoughts about Cambodia's chances and about the capabilities of the Khmer Rouge?
It changed as the war changed. The Cambodian infantry units and marine units, the armored forces, the blindés, who had basically upgunned 113s, and their artillery units, they were all well trained and well equipped. But that last year, or the last 6 months there, it was revealing, because the U.S. assistance was turned down. The Congress did not approve the extra funding required as Saigon was being enveloped and then Phnom Penh slowly being strangled. And so the extra funds were not authorized, and it was basically mathematical. You could look at how much ammunition was available for the 105s and how much was remaining, and there's no more coming in. And as you graph that out, you can see when you're going to hit critical point of low density of ammunition or no ammunition. The other thing is the Khmer Rouge were extremely brutal and ruthless enemy. The FANK units and leaders I talked to down at the troop level always thought, well, when the end comes, I went to high school with some of these guys, or I was from the same area. No one really then thought that they would be as ruthless. But again, there were indicators as different outposts and enclaves fell, and the brutality and the execution of those soldiers, government troops, by the Khmer Rouge, a lot of folks closed their eyes and said, well, that was an exception. That's not going to be the norm. And so they continued on, but as the areas were overrun, the ruthlessness got worse. And, the Khmer Rouge, this wasn't a volunteer army of college graduates. These were peasants. And these units led by fear and terror, and they were ruthless. And so at the very end, it was obvious there is going to be a bloodbath, and there's going to be no forgiveness. South Vietnam, when they fell, the North Vietnamese came in, and as you talk to survivors from the South Vietnamese units of re-education camps they had to go through. But they had re-education camps. As bad as that is, there weren't mass executions. And then when the Khmer Rouge took over Phnom Penh, as you're aware, began the tragedy of the killing fields. And that began with the complete evacuation of Phnom Penh. Every man, woman, child, person in a hospital bed, out of the city. They kept saying the Americans are going to bomb, and they told everyone to pack, to move. And I will link you up with 2 survivors who made it through that killing field with their parents till their father died. But there was no mercy with the Khmer Rouge. They began with they called Year Zero. When they overthrew the Khmer Republic, it was Year Zero. And by Year Zero, it was an agriculture-based society. Any traces of the Europeans, from the Americans to the French, was destroyed. An example is the French military cemetery in Phnom Penh, where from Indochina War, where those French soldiers who fell were buried. that was torn down, plowed over, and exists no more. Churches destroyed. So when you look at Vietnam and the North Vietnamese winning, complete world of difference. And I'm straying a little bit here to give you an example, but when the Khmer Rouge had the killing fields, and you'll talk to the survivors, it was a horrible life. There was no medical, there was no nothing. And people were taken away. If you had been a soldier, government official, a teacher, anything, they disappeared. They were thrown in the river, they were chained, and it's tragedy when you talk to the survivors. But at some point then, when Vietnam came across the border, it was a liberation by the North Vietnamese in the truest sense, not a propaganda sense, because they came in and pushed the Khmer Rouge out. And to those people who will tell you what happened when they were in the fields and the North Vietnamese soldiers came in and how they treated them well, they had total discipline. And when you talk, to Jill and Harry, they will tell you that if there was a crime done, if there was no rape, they were dealt with severely, the soldiers, if they did any violations. And so when you talk to them, you'll see how the Vietnamese army really was the liberator and ended the killing fields and Pol Pot's, killing machine, if you would. So that's a long discussion, but it's kind of how it turned out.
So if we dial it back, when you were fighting, or when you were revising but working in the field on operations with the Khmer Army, can you run us through some operations where there was combat?
Yeah, originally what we would do is we would split up the battalion into 3 separate companies. One company would have, the mortar section. The companies each had 60 mortars, and the battalion had the 81s. And we would go into an area of operations, and the AO would be divided up into sectors, green, blue, red, whatever, for each company. So the A team would be, divided up, with 3 individuals, perhaps 4 in some cases, with each company. And that was the company they stayed with from their arrival till their departure. So you had a really good relationship of advising. So as the XO of the team, I would have myself and 2 NCOs, and I would be with one company. I would have my AO. And so depending on the intelligence, we would move against it, or we would develop the situation. Example being, we had been crashing around out there for over a week, and we pulled in to perimeter one night. It's still light, and I was doing the perimeter check with the company commander, looking, because they would dig in as proper infantry would and have overhead cover. The mortars would be dug in their pits, and you'd have, aiming cards for every position, and your crew serve weapons, special attention on the avenues of approach. So as we went around, we'd been in that position, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and the teams were chopping away, cutting wood, getting their positions dug in. And things hadn't been going real well, and I was talking to the company commander, and I looked off, and here came a group of about, 4, 5, maybe 6 soldiers, rifles just over their shoulder, and just talking and jabbering away. And I said, and now we've got the tail section closing now. I said, and I looked, and they weren't Cambodians. It was, VC from the area. And they were going to somewhere. So we immediately had a contact. They broke out, and so we ended up getting dark. So next morning got out to go ahead and track them. We tracked them up into the Long Highs and through, up higher and higher, picking up their trail, until finally we got up there, and was able to get up close and put eyes on a base camp. And so had the company commander and said, explain the situation. And we figured out a maneuver plan to engage and went and assaulted, the position. The NBA or VC broke contact. We overran the camp and were able to pick up intelligence information. I think the most unique thing that I ever found anywhere in Vietnam or Cambodia was going through personal effects of one soldier. And he had a letter, and it was all wrapped up. And I got the letter, and I had my translator with me, and said, "Let's read this letter. Let's see what's going on here." And turns out it was from one of the VC, and he was writing home, and he said how horrible it is. Life sucks in the jungle. There are bugs, there are snakes. It's miserable. This is the worst place going on. And I thought, okay, this is a pretty good indicator of morale. So while we were there, consolidating, getting information, we got a radio call that a main force battalion was now moving back into the area, which was the camp we were in, their camp. And so we had to break contact, get back, and then eventually we linked up with the rest of the battalion and, had a very good, if you would, training operation. It was real, okay? There were casualties, but it was a confidence builder for that company commander and later the battalion commander to engage a force and not get pushed away. And that was absolutely critical, to have them learn, have confidence, and to get bloodied, get their feet wet, without loss of life, and if possible, on the friendlies.
Thank you. You talk about tracking the VC. Was there any sort of interaction still with Montagnards and people who are more skilled in tracking
There were very few, not in my camp. I had a former Kit Carson scout, Vietnamese, and he was good. And for me, after being a 1-0 and running against North Vietnamese, between me and my Kit Carson, we would go out and scout for the company and then the battalion, and we would find our targets or an ambush site and track. But the Kit Carson was a Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, who had been with American conventional units and SF units, very, very good quality. But no, I didn't have my Baru or Sedang or Jirai. It would have been a great opportunity, but the plan was in effect, and it was working with the interpreters that we had on hand.
What sort of cultural differences did you notice working with Cambodians compared to the other indigenous troops and Vietnamese you'd worked with before?
Well, you had a lot of more professional skills or experiences and education. In one of the photographs I sent you, and I can point it out, one of the enlisted soldiers there spoke perfect French, and I had been trained in French since grade school. So he had been a journalist, and for one of the newspapers in Phnom Penh till his number came up, as they say. And here was a well-educated man carrying an M16, as we have in many armies in the world. The battalion commanders were very well-trained, professional, and some of the senior NCOs actually had former experience as French colonial troops. And, not to the extent the South Vietnamese had, I would say, but what I was most impressed with was that you had individuals from different paths in life, that they were not peasants who were roped in by a blockade. That's how the Royal Navy does it, isn't it, to get you in? And to be brought into the force. And so that was, I think, a big difference. One of the biggest problems, though, with any government and any forces is corruption. And there was a lot of assistance given to the Khmer military. So they would get, we had a problem with what we call phantoms. They're not unique to Cambodia, but on the payroll, battalion's 512 soldiers. Okay, so the pay comes to the battalion commander and his designated staff, and so therefore those guys, they have pay for everyone. So we noticed there were a couple of holes here saying, wait a minute, we are a little short here, but not significant. But when they went back to Cambodia, a lot of the units were not at the readiness level that they reported. When they had losses, whether it was from casualties, killed in action, or soldiers who went over the hill, they didn't report it because they may be down one company in a battalion of 3, but that pay comes for an entire battalion of soldiers. And so there's corruption. And so the phantoms really was a problem. And I'm sure it's by different units, but it was a significant problem because the forces you think you have who are out there, you're wondering, why are they crumbling? And it's because, well, that's not a real battalion, that's a reinforced company, or that's 2 companies. So that was an issue, a significant problem that led to the collapse of the Khmer Republic and the FANK army.
I remember reading about a particular colonel in Cambodia who was very well respected, and he was sort of holding the line to the east of Phnom Penh.
The Basak River.
Possibly. Yeah. And he got because he was good and he challenged the corruption, they posted him to France. So he finished up in France when Phnom Penh fell, and he was one of the best airborne, or a colonel, I think. So you kind of imagine if that's what the leadership are doing with their army.
I think different units had different capabilities, and I think if you talk to, for example, the attachés at our embassy who were out every day and did an incredible job, they could give the exact status of the units that were good. For example, the Blonde, the armored, they were pretty good. The airborne, very good, I got to know. But then other different infantry units had these weaknesses, and it was by the leadership, and corruption was a problem.
So, do you have any other thoughts about the when you were training the guys in South Vietnam?
I think the biggest thing is it's an example of a very successful program. I mentioned earlier, have a very small group and one A-team, and we always say doctrinally, one A-team can advise indigenous of one battalion, but this is where it came together. And then it expanded, not only again with the South Vietnamese units after the Easter offensive of, okay, well, you've got 12 guys with this battalion. Okay, now you're going to have 6. Okay, 6 are going to go away on a mobile training team and going to train up in Hue or wherever it is. And it showed the capability that's inherent in the Special Forces A-team to train and advise and then equip and then to conduct combat operations. On top of that, it was, I think, one of the most successful unknown experiences that we have in Vietnam.
So what was the what sort of happened when those battalions went back into Cambodia and set up? At that point, did they have any American communications with them to assist them in their disposition, or strategically, or anything like that?
In the Military Equipment Delivery Team, Cambodia, MEDTC, the unit was prohibited. This is the unit in Cambodia who were prohibited by the Cooper Church Amendment from advising. However, to get out to the units, every unit, would be what we called an EIUI, End Item Equipment Inspection. What that means is we would have team members. In addition, I mentioned the attachés, who were the real heroes going out every day. But to go to each unit, to get out there and to make sure that, one, they have their equipment, they're using it properly, and you can't do that if you don't advise. And there were reporters who I actually linked up with, one who would hunt us down out there to see if we were violating the law for the Washington Post to report on, or whatever paper. But to go out there and to be there, the hardest thing to me was to leave. The last visit I had to Sve Rang with Rod Pascal, a great soldier, was out there making sure the mortar pits were good and everything. But this was the same time the North Vietnamese were coming around the west of Saigon. Between us and Saigon, the NVA were moving in, and the Cambodians went out and got hammered. And the North Vietnamese came back on the radio and said, "Our objective is Saigon. If you come out, you'll be destroyed." And the commanders acknowledged it. We advised, dig in. And then the saddest thing was, you're in a surrounded enclave, but yet here comes the Air America helicopter at the end of the day, and we would go back to our surrounded enclave in Phnom Penh and have to leave that unit. Same thing the day before we evacuated in Operation Eagle Pull. I was up with the Airborne Brigade, one of the battalions up on the Basak River, with their commander and friends. And I fully knew that we were doing Operation Eagle Pull the next morning, the evacuation. But when I left, they said, "We'll see you tomorrow. Bring a case of beer." It was tough. It is very hard to leave someone on their own that we brought into the fight, and then assistance was cut off. And that's something I have to live with.
Was it possible for you to remain in contact with anybody after you left?
Yes, in several ways. First of all, when we were evacuated, we went out to the carrier and the Marine helicopters. We had our LZ out by the embassy, and I think it was the USS Iwo Jima, if I'm not mistaken, or Okinawa. And from there, we moved to Thailand, to Utapao Air Force Base, and then down in Samysun, we had our rear camp there. So we were still doing airdrops from there of supplies and ammunition until the Khmer Rouge came in that week later or less. But maybe about a week or two later, I got a call, and it was from it was inside Thailand, and there was a refugee camp that had just been set up, and had someone there and said, "Hey, somebody wants to talk to you." So it was one of my soldiers who I had actually been with South Vietnamese in Vietnam, one of our scouts. And then he was Khmer Krum, he was Cambodian, and he was back in Cambodia. So he'd always stay there. He could check in, I'd go to his unit. So it's this guy, he's on the phone. And I said, "Where are you? What are you doing?" And he explained that after we pulled out, he went up to the embassy, he saw my Jeep. After the Khmer Rouge came in the next week, and he didn't know what was going, so he just went back to the jungle, and he E&E'd across the border, and I was able to sponsor him and bring him to the States, and took him down to Fort Benning with me when I got home. And then he started off in his own life. I had another soldier I sent out. As the end was coming, there were opportunities to send soldiers to the States for different training courses. So one young man was so good. And this was, in the final 2 months or so, I got him to the States to go train. So he was already in position in the States, and ended up sponsoring him also, and helping them get settled. But the most unique one is, about 3 years ago, I received a letter, and had a Cambodian name on the return address, and it was up in McLean, Virginia. And the letter began, please excuse me if you're not who I think you are, but are you Captain Bowra? My family and I lived in Phnom Penh, and you used to come to my parents' store, and we developed a friendship. I was 16, and I did the interpreting in French for you. And, we communicated in French because her parents didn't speak it. And so I got to know her. She was 16 with pigtails. And it turns out, as I read the letter, this is who I thought it was. And it said, again, if this isn't you, please excuse me, I wish you well. And had a phone number, so I called. And so her American name is Jill. And Jill is in McLean. Her brother made it out with her, and her mother, who I knew the whole family. And I thought everyone I knew had been killed, without a doubt. No one survives the killing fields. Well, they did. And they made it out and settled in McLean, Virginia, where they now have a jeweler's store. And their mother and Jill and Harry came down and met with me. We've been together. Well, we communicate every week. Their mom passed away about a year ago. But their father died in the killing fields. Their grandmother died in the killing fields. And when they tried to escape unsuccessfully, their mother had kept a lot of gold and jewelry. They got cross into Vietnam eventually. And so here's 12-year-old Harry is telling me how he's with the North Vietnamese soldiers, because they were all camped there. He said, these guys were really good. He said, they took me out, taught me how to shoot the AK-47, and it's the complete opposite of some of the bad stories, and experiences we all have against an armed enemy, the NVA. But at that point, usually they were very professional. So Harry and Jill are still up in Virginia, and I will link you up with them and their account. Their day started at 4 a.m. in the fields working and didn't finish till 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Then they had to march back several miles back to get several hours sleep, no medicine. It's an incredible story of survival. And Harry had to drain fields so they could get rice to grow. And he talks about digging in and hitting a 40 millimeter shell and having it explode on the far side of his shovel. Things that they went through. So they are my best friends. I never thought I would ever see them again. And it goes to show you there are miracles.
Thank you, Ken. I just wonder what your thoughts must have been. The real impact that the fall of Cambodia had on so many people. Have you thought over the years about what could have been done differently, perhaps?
I think the fix was a short-term fix if we had the continued funding. The Khmer Rouge had come too far so long, and they had different factions in there. They had, Khmer Rouge, they had former royals, who still liked Sihanouk, but Pol Pot was a reincarnated Hitler on steroids. Total killer, madman. And but these units continued to close, and we knew it was the end when we had 105s that were captured, and going out to Po Shin Tong airfield every day to get supplies or to move people. There were a lot of 107 rockets coming in Phnom Penh all the time, that after the the New Year's offensive. But then all of a sudden we started taking 105 fire, and that's when they had captured 105s. And then the airfields were closed, and then the only resupplies could be from out of Thailand. And of course the river convoys, but then the river convoys got choked and the rivers got blocked. And the last convoy got hit very heavy. So could it have been done differently? Let's say the funding was approved that we had requested the United States, and I think it would have just been extending the misery, the war. I would have still liked to have seen that. Could peace have been brought about with the Khmer Rouge? No, I don't think so. It's a tragedy in that we as a nation brought them into this war to facilitate our operations in our war in Vietnam. And very often, the war in the Khmer with the Khmer Republic is our ally. It's often called, a sideshow to Vietnam. It was never the main effort. It was there to serve a purpose. But then, again, everything went south for South Vietnam with the North Vietnamese coming in, and then lack of assistance and lack of troops. And so I think it would have been something, if it had changed, it would have had to been done in the first year, second year maybe of the war, to really eliminate the Khmer Rouge and their capability, or the KC, you could call them the Khmer Communist. So it's sad, it's tragedy. We brought them into it. It was a gentle land, as people describe Cambodia. It was a beautiful country. And they went through a hell. When people say no more Holocaust, there was one terrible Holocaust there. And you can look at the numbers that were killed or died, and it's a tragedy.
Have you ever been back?
No, have not. Not sure if I'm ready to go back.